Hi, welcome to our continuation of the Celestine prophecy. Okay, out the window far below, I could see a large city. Judging from our flight path, I suspected it was Orlando, Florida. I was struck by the geometric outlines of streets and avenues, the planned and ordered configuration of what humans had built. I looked over at Dobson. His eyes were closed, and he appeared to be asleep. For an hour, he had told me more about the second insight. Then our lunch had arrived and we had eaten, and I'd told him about Charlene and why I had decided to come to Peru. Afterward, I wanted only to gaze out of cloud formations and consider what he had said. So what do you think? He asked suddenly, looking sleepily over at me. Have you grasped the second insight? I'm not sure. He nodded towards the other passengers. Do you feel as if you have a clearer perspective on the human world? Do you see how preoccupied everyone has been? This perspective explains a lot. How many people do you know who are obsessed with their work, who are type A, or have stress-related diseases, and who can't slow down? They can't slow down because they use their routine to distract themselves, to reduce life to only its practical considerations. And they do this to avoid recalling how uncertain they are about why they live. The second insight extends our consciousness of historical time, he added. It shows us how to observe culture, not just from the perspective of our own lifetimes, but from the perspective of a whole millennium. It reveals our preoccupation to us, and so lifts us above it. You have just experienced this longer history. You now live in a longer now. When you look at the human world now, you should be able to clearly see this obsessiveness, the intense preoccupation with economic progress. But what's wrong with that? I protested. It's what made Western civilization great. He laughed loudly. Of course you're right. No one's saying it was wrong. In fact, the manuscript says the preoccupation was a necessary development, a stage in human evolution. Now, however, we've spent enough time settling into the world. It's time now to wake up from the preoccupation and reconsider our original question. What's behind life on this planet? Why are we really here? I looked at him for a long time, then asked, Do you think that other insights explain this purpose? Dobson cocked his head. I think it's worth a look. I just hope no one destroys the rest of the manuscript before we have a chance to find out. How could the Peruvian government think they could destroy an important artifact and get away with it? I asked. They would do it covertly, he replied. The official line is that the manuscript doesn't exist at all. I would think the scientific community would be up in arms. He looked at me with an expression of resolve. We are. That's why I'm returning to Peru. I represent 10 prominent scientists, all of whom demand that the original manuscript be made public. I sent a letter to the relevant department heads within the Peruvian government, telling them that I was coming, and that I expected cooperation. I see. I wonder how they will respond. Probably with denials, but at least it will be an official start. He turned away, deep in thought, and I stared out the window again. As I looked down, it dawned on me that the airplane on which we were riding contained, within its technology, 4 centuries of progress. We had learnt much about manipulating the resources we had found on the earth. How many people, I mused. How many generations did it take to create the products and the understanding that enabled this airplane to come into being? And how many spent their whole lives focused on one tiny aspect, one small step, without ever lifting their heads from that preoccupation? Suddenly, in that instant, the span of history Dobson and I had been discussing seemed to integrate fully into my consciousness. I could see the millennium clearly, as though it was a part of my own life history. 1,000 years ago, we had lived in a world where God and human spirituality were clearly defined, and then we had lost it. Or better, we had decided there was more to the story. Accordingly, we had sent explorers out to discover the real truth and to report back. And when they had taken too long, we had become preoccupied with a new secular purpose, one of settling into the world, of making ourselves more comfortable. And settled we had. We discovered that metallic ores could be melted down and fashioned into all kinds of gadgets. We invented sources of power, first steam, then gas, and electricity and pison. We systemized farming and mass production, and now commanded huge stores of material goods and vast networks of distribution. Propelling it all was the call to progress, desire of the individual to provide his own security, his own purpose, while he was waiting for the truth. We had decided to create a more comfortable and pleasurable life for ourselves and our children, and in a mere 400 years, our preoccupation had created a human world where all the comforts of life could now be produced. The problem was that our focused, obsessive drive to conquer nature and make ourselves more comfortable had left the natural system of the planet polluted and on the verge of collapse. We couldn't go on this way. Dobson was right. The second insight did make our new awareness seem inevitable. We were reaching a climax in our cultural purpose. We were accomplishing what we collectively decided to do, and as this happened, our preoccupation was breaking down, and we were waking up to something else. I could almost see the momentum of the modern age slowing as we approached the end of the millennium. A 400-year-old obsession had been completed. We'd created the means of material security, and now we seemed to be ready, poised in fact, to find out why we had done it. In the faces of passengers around me, I could see evidence of the preoccupation, but also I thought I detected brief glimpses of awareness. How many, I wondered, had already noticed the coincidences? The plane tilted forward and began its descent as the flight attendant announced that we would soon be landing in Lima. I gave Dobson the name of my hotel and asked where he was staying. He gave me the name of his hotel and said it was only a couple of miles from mine. "What is your plan?" I asked. "I've been thinking about that," he replied. "The first thing, I guess, is to visit the American embassy and tell them why I'm here, just for the record. Good idea. After that, I'm going to speak with as many Peruvian scientists as I can. The scientists at the University of Lima have already told me that they have no knowledge of the manuscript, but there are other scientists who are working at various ruins who may be willing to talk. What about you? What are your plans?" "I have none," I replied. "Do you mind if I tag along?" "Not at all. I was going to suggest it." After the plane landed, we picked up our luggage and agreed to meet later at Dobson's hotel. I walked outside and hailed a taxi in the fading twilight. The air was dry and the wind was very brisk. As my cab drove away, I noticed another taxi pull out quickly behind us, then lag back in the traffic. It stayed with us through several turns, and I could make out a lone figure in the back. A rush of nervousness filled my stomach. I asked the driver, who could speak English, not to go directly to the hotel, but to drive around for a while. I told him I was interested in sightseeing. He complied without comment. The taxi followed. What was this all about? When we arrived at my hotel, I told the driver to stay in the car. Then I opened the door and pretended to be paying the fare. The taxi following behind us pulled up on the curb some distance away, and the man stepped out and walked slowly towards the hotel entrance. I jumped back into the vehicle and shut the door, telling the cabbie to drive on. As we sped away, the man walked into the street and watched us until we were out of his sight. I could see my driver's face in the rearview mirror. He was watching me closely, his expression tense. "Sorry about this," I said. "I've decided to change accommodations." I struggled to smile and gave him the name of Dobson's Hotel, although part of me wanted to go straight to the airport and take the first plane back to the States. A half block short of the destination, I had the driver pull over. "Wait here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The streets were filled with people, mostly native Peruvians, but here and there I passed some Americans and Europeans. Something about seeing the tourists made me feel safer. When I was within 50 yards of the hotel, I stopped. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, as I watched, gunshots rang out and screams filled the air. The crowd in front of me flung themselves to the ground, opening up my view down the sidewalk. Dobson was running toward me, wild-eyed, panicked. Figures behind him pursued. One fired his gun in the air and ordered Dobson to halt. As he ran closer, Dobson strained to focus and recognized me. "Run!" he yelled. "For God's sake, run!" I turned and ran down an alley in terror. Ahead was a vertical board fence, 6 feet high, blocking my way. When I reached it, I leaped as high as I could, catching the top of the boards with my hands and flinging my right leg over the top. As I pulled my left leg over and dropped to the other side, I looked back down the alley. Dobson was running desperately. More shots were fired. He stumbled and fell. I continued to run blindly, leaping piles of trash and stacks of cardboard boxes. For a moment I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Ahead, the alley ran into the next street, which was also crowded with people, seemingly unalarmed. As I entered the street, I dared a glance to my rear, my heart pounding. No one was there. I walked hurriedly down the sidewalk to the right, trying to fade into the crowd. Why did Dobson run? I asked myself. Was he killed? Wait a minute, someone said in a loud whisper from behind my left shoulder. I started to run, but he reached out and grabbed my arm. Please, wait a minute, he said again. I saw what happened. I'm trying to help you. Who are you? I asked, trembling. I'm Wilson James, he said. I'll explain later, but right now we have to get off these streets. Something about his voice and demeanour calmed my panic, so I decided to follow him. We walked up the street and into a leather goods store. He nodded to a man behind the counter and led me into a musty spare room in the back. He shut the door and closed the curtains. He was a man in his 60s, although he seemed much younger. A sparkle in his eyes or something. His skin was dark brown and his hair was black. He looked of Peruvian descent, but the English he spoke sounded almost American. He wore a bright blue t-shirt and jeans. You'll be safe here for a while, he said. Why are they chasing you? I didn't respond. You'll hear about the manuscript, aren't you? He asked. How did you know that? I guess the man with you was here for that reason too. Yes, his name is Dobson. How did you know there were two of us? I have a room over the alley. I was looking out the window as they were chasing you. Did they shoot Dobson? I asked, terrified by what I might hear in reply. I don't know, he said. I couldn't tell. But once I saw you had escaped, I ran down the back steps to head you off. I thought perhaps I could help. Why? For an instant he looked at me as though he was uncertain how to answer my question. Then his expression changed to one of warmth. You won't understand this, but I was standing there at the window and thought about an old friend came to mind. He's dead now. He died because he thought people should know about the manuscript. When I saw what was happening in the valley, I felt I should help you. He was right. I didn't understand, but I had the feeling he was absolutely truthful with me. I was about to ask another question when he spoke again. We can talk about this later, he said. I think we'd better move to a safer place. Wait a minute, Wilson, I said. I just want to find a way back to the States. How can I do this? Call me Will, he replied. I don't think you should try the airport, not yet. If they're still looking for you, they'll be checking there. I have some friends who live out of town. They will hide you. There are several other ways out of the country you can choose. When you're ready, they will show you where to go. He opened the door to the room and checked inside the shop, then walked outside and checked the street. When he returned, he motioned for me to follow. We walked down the street to a blue jeep that Will pointed out. As we got in, I noticed that the back seat was carefully packed with foodstuffs and tents and satchels, as if for an extended trip. We rode in silence. I leaned back in the passenger seat and tried to think. My stomach was knotted with fear. I'd never expected this. What if I'd been arrested and thrown into Peruvian jail, or killed outright? I had to size up my situation. I had no clothes, but I did have money and one credit card, and for some reason I trusted Will. What had you and who was it, Dobson, done to get those people after you? Will asked, replied. Nothing that I know of, I replied. I met Dobson on the plane. He's an historian, and he was coming down here to investigate the manuscript officially. He represents a group of other scientists. Will looked surprised. Did the government know he was coming? Yes. He had written certain government officials that he wanted cooperation. I can't believe they tried to arrest him. He didn't even have copies with him. His copies of the manuscript? Only of the first two insights. I had no idea there were copies in the United States. Where did he get them? On an earlier trip, he was told a certain priest knew of the manuscript. He couldn't find them, but he found the copies hidden behind his house. Will looked sad. Jose. Who? I asked. He was the friend I told you about, the one who was killed. He was adamant that as many people as possible hear about the manuscript. What happened to him? He was murdered. We don't know by whom. His body was found in the forest miles from his house, but I have to think it was his enemies. The government? Certain people in the government were in the church. His church would go that far? Perhaps. The church is secretly against the manuscript. There are a few priests who understand the document and advocate it covertly, but they must be very careful. Jose talked of it openly to anyone who wanted to know. I warned him for months before his death to be more subtle, to stop giving copies to anyone who came along. He told me he was doing what he knew he must. When was the manuscript first discovered? I asked. It was first translated 3 years ago. but no one knows when it was first discovered. The original floated around for years, we think among the Indians, until it was found by Jose. He alone managed to get it translated. Of course, once the church found out what the manuscript said, they tried to suppress it totally. Now all we have are copies. We think they destroyed the original. Will had driven east out of town. We were riding on a narrow two-lane road through a heavily irrigated area. We passed several small plank dwellings, and then a large pasture with expensive fencing. Did Dobson tell you about the first two insights? Will asked. He told me about the second insight, I replied. I have a friend who told me of the first. She talked to a priest at another time, to Jose, I guess. Do you understand these two insights? I think so. Do you understand that chance encounters often have a deeper meaning? It seems, I said, like this whole trip has been one coincidental event after another. That begins to happen once you become alert and connect with the energy. Connected? Will smiled. There's something mentioned further in the manuscript. I'd like to hear about it, I said. Let's talk about it later, he said, indicating with a nod, but he was turning the vehicle into a gravel driveway. 100 feet ahead was a modest wood frame house. Will pulled up beneath a large tree to the right of the house and stopped. My friend works for the owner of the large farming estate who owns much of this land in this area, he said, and provides this house. The man is very powerful and secretly supportive of the manuscript. You'll be safe here. Porch light flicked on, and a short, squat man who appeared to be a native Peruvian rushed out, smiling broadly and saying something enthusiastically in Spanish. When he reached the jeep, he patted Will on the back through the open window and glanced pleasantly over at me. Will asked him to speak in English, then introduced us. He needs a little help, Will said to the man. He wants to return to the States, but he'll have to be very careful. I guess I'm going to leave him with you. The man was looking closely at Will. You're about to go after the ninth insight again, aren't you? He asked. Yes, Will said, getting out of the jeep. I opened my door and walked around the vehicle. Will and his friend were strolling toward the house, having a conversation I couldn't hear. As I walked up, the man said, I will start the preparations, then walked away. Will turned to me. What do you mean? I asked when he questioned you about the ninth insight. There is a part of the manuscript that has never been found. There were 8 insights with the original text, but one more insight, the ninth, was mentioned there. Many people have been searching for it. Do you know where it is? No, not really. And how are you going to find it? Will smiled. The same way Jose found the original 8. The same way they found the first 2, and then ran into me. If one can connect and build up enough energy, the coincidental events begin to happen constantly. Tell me how to do that, I said. Which insight is it? Will looked at me as if assessing my level of understanding. How to connect is not just one insight, it's all of them. Remember in the second insight where it describes how explorers will be sent out into the world utilizing the scientific method to discover the meaning of human life on this planet? But they would not return right away. Yes. Well, the remainder of the insights represents the answers finally coming back. But they aren't just coming from institutional science. The answers I'm talking about are coming from many different areas of inquiry. The finding of physics, psychology, mysticism, and religion are all coming together in a new synthesis based on a perception of the coincidences. We're learning the details of what coincidences mean, how they work, and as we do, we're constructing a whole new view of life, insight by insight. Then I want to hear about each insight, I said. Can you explain them to me before you go? I found it doesn't work that way. You must discover each one of them in a different way. How? It just happens. Wouldn't work for me just to tell you. You might have the information about each of them, but you wouldn't have the insights. You have to discover them in the course of your own life. We stared at each other in silence. Will smiled. Talking with him made me feel incredibly alive. Why are you going after the ninth insight now? I asked. It's the right time. I've been a guide here, and I know the terrain, and I understand all 8 insights. When I was at my window over the alley thinking of Jose, I'd already decided to go north one more time. The ninth insight is out there, I know it, and I'm not getting any younger. Besides, I've envisioned myself finding it and achieving what it says. I know it is the most important of the insights, puts all of the others into perspective, and gives us the true purpose of life. He paused, suddenly looking serious. I would have left 30 minutes earlier, but I had this nagging feeling that I'd forgotten something. He paused again. That's precisely when you showed up. We looked at each other for a long time. You think I'm supposed to go with you? I asked. What do you think? I don't know, I said, unsure of myself. I felt confused. The story of my Peruvian trip was flashing before my mind. Charlene, Dobson, now Will. I had to come to Peru because of a mild curiosity, and now I find myself in hiding, an unwitting fugitive who didn't even know who his pursuers were. And the strangest thing of all was that at this moment, instead of being terrified, totally panicked, I find myself in a state of excitement. I should have been summoning all my wits and instincts to find a way home. But what I really wanted to do was to go with Will, into what would undoubtedly be more danger. As I considered my options, I realized that in reality I had no choice. The second insight had ended my possibility of going back to my old preoccupations. If I was going to stay aware, I had to go forward. I planned to spend the night, Will said. So you will have until tomorrow morning to decide. I've already decided, I told him. I want to go. That's it for today. Don't forget to check the links down below. Check the links on my channel. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you know when the next video will be uploaded. Take care and blessed be.